Welcome everyone to today's session of the Hot Topics in Nutrition, Don't Let Carbs Spook You by Hannah Dalpiaz. This program is hosted by the Blum Resource Center. Over at the Blum, we are grateful to the nutrition team for this continued partnership. The recording of this session will be posted on our Blum YouTube playlist and our Blum Digital Resource Center. For those of you watching live, if you have any questions related to today's program, please feel free to utilize the chat feature throughout the session. At the end of the session, your questions in the chat will be used to moderate a Q&A. If you have any other questions or would like more information about resources and programs offered through the Blum, please visit our website at www.dana-farber.org/resource center or email us at blum_center@dfci.harvard.edu. Thank you all for joining us. I will now pass the workshop over to Hannah.
Great. Thank you so much. As mentioned, the topic for today is going to be Don't Let Carbs Spook You. So for just a little bit of background about what we're going to talk about today, I think frequently as a dietitian, specifically at Dana-Farber, a lot of patients have a little bit of apprehension about carbohydrates. They maybe feel a little bit scared to eat them or include them in their diet. Some of the sentiments we frequently hear from patients are things like, does sugar feed cancer? I've heard carbs cause weight gain. I don't eat fruit because it has too much sugar or too many carbs. My diet doesn't allow me to eat carbs. So I think there's a lot of information and misinformation out there about carbohydrates. So my goal for today is to just give some background about what are carbohydrates. Maybe why do we need them as part of a balanced diet? What are they? Where can they fit? And just give some general background about carbohydrates, hopefully to make them feel a little less spooky. So for starters, kind of what is a carbohydrate? So it is one of the three macronutrients found in food. The other two that you may be familiar with or have heard of are fat and protein. Specifically, the fiber or starches and sugars that are found in fruits, grains, vegetables, and milk products. And the body breaks down carbohydrates into glucose, which is the tiniest building block of sugar. It's also the preferred source of fuel for our body. So when we think about carbs, I think it's important to talk about what do carbohydrates do for our body. So again, carbohydrates are the preferred fuel source of the body. Some of the biggest consumers of carbohydrates in our body are actually the brain and the nerves. Carbohydrates fuel the central nervous system, and they provide energy for working muscles. So they help prevent protein from being used as an energy source and also help enable fat metabolism, or allowing our body to break down fat for energy. Specifically, even if you cut all sugar out of your diet, your body still has the ability, and actually needs the ability to make glucose so that your brain can function. And when we think about carbohydrates playing a role in brain function, specifically, they can influence our mood and our memory. And when we think about kind of diets that are very low in carbohydrate, or if we go too long without eating carbs, this role in brain function is actually the explanation for some of the symptoms we get or feel, specifically if you think of those symptoms of kind of hunger or hungry and angry, that lack of focus, the fatigue, or even on a very low carbohydrate diet, you may have a sensation of feeling shaky. And this actually comes from the brain's signals to the body, sending this kind of core sensation of, I need to eat whatever is fastest, quickest, cheapest. Essentially, the body's kind of safety mechanism to correct that low intake of fuel for our brain. The body does store glucose in the liver. So when we don't have enough source of glucose from carbohydrate in our diet, it actually does start to break down the building blocks in muscle and fat to help make glucose through those kind of metabolic processes. So part of why we need that adequate carbohydrate, protein, and fat is to protect our muscles and organs so that we're not breaking down our muscle for use as fuel. And then specifically the RDA, or recommended daily allowance of carbohydrate, is actually based on the amount of carbohydrate our brain needs to function each day, which is roughly 135 grams per day. So next, just to give a little bit of background in the kind of terminology of things, you may have heard the terms simple or complex carbohydrates. So this actually just refers to kind of the chemical structure and speed of absorption. So thinking back to my biochemistry classes, when we think about a simple carbohydrate, it is basically the monosaccharides and disaccharides. So monosaccharides meaning one sugar unit, or disaccharides meaning two sugar units. So examples of monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, which is the fruit found in sugar, galactose, which is found in milk products, or disaccharides, which are these two molecule combinations, things like maltose, lactose, sucrose, also known as table sugar, which is a combination of glucose and fructose. Simple carbohydrates can be found in kind of sweetened foods, things like candy, soda, and syrup, but they're also fine, which are more processed and refined sugars. So they're going to lack vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, and fibers. And when they are consumed, especially in large quantities, they can lead to a very quick spike in your blood sugar levels, causing those to go up rapidly. This depends mostly on the quantity consumed, but the simple sugars do tend to lead to a quicker rise in blood sugar. Complex carbohydrates, in contrast, are what we call polysaccharides. So this just means they have 3 or more units of sugar. Oftentimes you'll hear them referred to as starches, but specifically they are starches, fibers, and glycogen. Examples of complex carbs in foods are things like beans, peas, lentils, peanuts, potatoes, corn, or also things like parsnips, whole grain breads, and cereals. So then when we think about starches, some of these starches or grains can be full of nutrition. Sometimes they have less nutrition. So when we think about the starches that come from vegetables or grains, again, this is going to include things like peas, corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, squash, or legumes, which is the family that includes lentils and beans. It's also grains like oats, barley, rice, wheat. These can be whole grains, which essentially just means they have the bran, which has the fiber, the germ, which is the nutrient-rich portion of the grain, and the endosperm, which is the starchy component. Or they can be more refined, which means that parts of those nutrients have been stripped away. Whole grains, part of the benefit of them is that they provide both the fiber, the vitamins, the minerals, and the phytonutrients. And again, examples of that could be brown rice, quinoa, spelt, millet, oatmeal, bulgur, or other cereal and bread grains that have that 100% whole grain designation. You'll see specifically on the slide some examples of what that would look like. The Whole Grain Council has a label that you'll see in the top right corner that could give you a clue around whole grain products. The other place you would look, as you'd see in the bottom right-hand corner, is the ingredients label. Generally, you would see something like 100% whole grain and the type of grain, or 100% whole wheat flour. That is what's going to give you an indication of the whole grain component. Versus your more refined grains, which again, these are things that are processed. So generally both the bran and the germ are removed. So as a result, you're losing some of the health benefits of those grains. The next component we're going to talk about is fiber. So fiber is a nutrient that is specifically found in plant foods. So these would include fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes. Again, legumes being those dried beans, peas, and lentils. Fiber is what helps keep things moving through our digestion or digestive tract. It helps promote healthy gut health by feeding the healthy bacteria in our intestine. It also has benefits that can help lower cholesterol, improve digestion, lower our blood sugars, and reduce risk of heart disease. Specifically because those fibers are not fully digested, it slows the absorption of starches and simple sugars, which is part of why we see that benefit in blood sugar. So we see a lower rise in blood sugar as well as a more gradual time to bring that blood sugar back down, which is helpful for how we use that fuel for energy. Fiber also helps us feel full when we're eating, which can have benefits for weight management. For optimal health, the recommendation is that adults get between 25 to 30 grams of fiber per day. Based on kind of research, the typical American gets about half this amount. So it can be a really beneficial addition and reason to include a variety of carbohydrates in one's diet. And then when we look at the food label, sometimes you'll see the designation as kind of excellent source of fiber or good source of fiber. And those are standards put in place based on the food label. So an excellent source of fiber specifically means that it has 5 or more grams of fiber. And then a good source of fiber specifically is going to have 2.5 grams or more per serving. So that's just a helpful tool and reminder. The next thing we're going to talk about is carbohydrates as a source of phytonutrients. This is a term I've maybe used once already or twice in our presentation this afternoon. So kind of what does that mean? Carbohydrates as a source of phytonutrients. So phyto specifically is the Greek word for plants. So we're talking about kind of those plant-based nutrients. So phytonutrients act as the immune system of the plant. There's over 100,000 that exist in countless combinations in plant foods. They're actually what give plants their unique color, taste, smell. They act as natural antioxidants and have anti-inflammatory properties, as well as act as kind of natural detoxifiers. Actually, based on the research and studies out there, this is actually the primary reason that we feel plant-based diets or diets that are rich in plant foods hold benefit for fighting disease because of these unique compounds that fruits, vegetables, and other plant foods contain. You may have heard some of these compounds by their various kind of categories or names, things like isothionates, polyphenols, carotenoids. But essentially, one helpful approach to including a variety of these foods is kind of the adage of eating the rainbow. Different color families actually have different phytonutrient compounds or benefits. So when we choose plant foods from across the color palette, we're actually getting the widest variety of these kind of plant immune boosting benefits. So what you'll see here on this next slide is rather than breaking down kind of in the traditional fruit versus vegetable sense, we highlight by different color families or color categories, fruits and vegetables that fall in each of these categories. This would also include even things derived from plants like herbs and spices. So when you're thinking about kind of your plate throughout the week, it can be helpful to use something like this as a tool of what categories are you already eating regularly, what do you enjoy, and are there ways to expand the color of your carbohydrates that you're eating throughout the week. So kind of as part of this carbohydrate conversation, we also want to think about kind of sugar and how is this part of the same conversation? So sugar can be naturally occurring. So think things like fruit and dairy, or even whole grains, these grain-based foods, or it can be more highly processed or added in nature. So these are going to be things more like your sodas and sweets. Sugar goes by many names, ranging from things like table sugar, brown sugar, confectioner's sugar, powdered sugar, honey, agave, raw sugar, maple syrup, high fructose corn syrup. But one of the things we want to think about is these all represent types of carbohydrates that don't provide a lot, at least the added sugars, they don't provide a lot of added nutrition. And when we consume them in large quantities, the largest concern is ultimately that they may be displacing other healthful foods within our diet, things that have maybe more quality or more nutrition to them. So kind of piggybacking off of that, I think one of the most common questions or concepts that comes up is this does sugar feed cancer? And in many ways, this isn't kind of as simple of a concept as it sounds like. The overarching kind of concept is that chronic high intake of simple sugars can lead to changes in how we produce and regulate hormones like insulin, which could change factors about how our cells grow over time. But when we kind of zoom out a little bit, to date, there are no specific randomized control trials that show sugar is directly causing cancer to grow, develop, increase, kind of any of those direct relationships. Where we see this kind of indirect link or relationship between sugar and cancer is that there is some limited evidence from controlled trials that shows, especially high intake of things like sugar sweetened beverages or high added sugar diets can over time lead to inflammation and elevated levels of circulating insulin. And especially for people who are maybe more sensitive to those changes in circulating insulin levels, a diet that's high in these sugar sweetened beverages or added sugars could lay the groundwork for changes in how your cells are developing over time. So for right now, what we see is that kind of there isn't a direct link to cancer risk, but more of a secondary link that diets that are high, chronically high in sugar consumption, likely it's more of a marker for a diet that's low in foods that are going to promote health and reduce cancer risk. For example, these colorful fruits and vegetables or more naturally occurring sources of carbohydrate. And then where we think about kind of sugar having an impact on our body's production and use of insulin. Just like we talked about glucose being a necessary fuel source for the body, insulin is also necessary. Insulin does have some characteristics that are kind of similar to growth factors within our body, but without kind of getting too much into the nitty-gritty of the biochemistry behind this. Basically, how I just like to describe insulin as kind of the key that opens up our cells, kind of opens the gas cap of the cells to allow that sugar or those individual glucose units to come from our bloodstream into our cells so that we can use it as sugar. As fuel for the cells. So the more sugar we consume, particularly those higher sources of added sugar, over time, the more insulin that's needed so that we can use that sugar as an effective fuel source. So this is kind of the key to where there's an intersection between sugar and cancer, is that if there's a chronic high consumption, over time that can drive up production of insulin, which could change kind of factors around our cells. But it's not something where there's a one-to-one relationship where if you have a piece of Halloween candy tonight or enjoy a piece of birthday cake, that we're seeing this immediate cause and effect. It's patterns that chronically lead to excess weight gain, that lead to decreased sensitivity of the cells to the insulin. So it's a much more kind of chronic picture than it is kind of intermittent consumption of these foods. And along those same lines, not all carbs are created equal. So in this example, we're thinking about kind of looking at, say, donut versus an orange. Both are somewhat similar in terms of their grams of sugar. But if we look at the donut, that has a higher calorie profile, more like 200 calories per serving, 10 grams of sugar, so actually less than the orange. But these are largely added sugar grams. It does not have any fiber. It does not have any phytonutrients. The orange, in contrast, is lower calories at 62, has 12 grams of sugar, but those are naturally occurring sugars. It also has 3 grams of fiber, which is going to help you feel full longer, help with digestion, help slow the rise in blood sugar. And then there's also 170 different phytonutrients present. So kind of as a dietitian, my approach is never to tell a patient that a food is off limits or even to assign morality to a food with this concept of, say, good food versus bad food, but rather thinking a big picture that not all carbohydrates are the same. That doesn't mean to eliminate the donut, but rather think about kind of how much and how often, or what am I eating it alongside, and also think about what are the other health benefits that a food may have or not have, but think about kind of where it fits into the big picture, as part of one's diet. So then when we think about kind of where do these foods fit onto our plate, I think this is a really nice resource from the AICR, or the American Institute for Cancer Research. It's what they describe as their Healthy American Plate, or the New American Plate. So essentially the concept is that at least 2/3 of the plate are filled with these unprocessed plant foods. So that's going to be things like vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, a lot of these naturally occurring carbohydrates we've been talking about. And then the remaining third of your plate could be filled with your other protein sources. Could be animal food sources like poultry, fish, unprocessed lean meats. Could also be things like dairy, or even other plant-based proteins like soy. And essentially the emphasis is on intake of minimally processed but nutrient dense plant foods. So these are going to have fiber, nutrients, and again, as we talked to, these seem to be the compounds that hold the most protection against both cancer and other chronic diseases. Again, highlighting that the benefit of fiber is that it slows that release of sugar into your bloodstream, resulting in a slower rise and then more time to lead to a gradual fall of those blood sugar levels. We see those same benefits when we pair carbohydrate foods with fat and protein in the diet. So that also just naturally helps curb that spike in blood sugar. And as a result, we see less of those spikes in insulin. That is part of kind of what we're worried about long term. So then again, from kind of a practical approach, one of the other kind of AICR recommendations is kind of go for the whole grain. So there is some research that actually shows eating 3 servings of whole grain foods per day can reduce colorectal cancer risk by 17%. So when we think about what does a serving of whole grain look like, here are a couple of examples. Could be a slice of 100% whole grain bread, a half a cup of cooked brown rice, 3 cups popped popcorn, a 6-inch corn tortilla. And then again, from kind of that practicality perspective, some quick tips on buying breads or cereals. Kind of what are you looking for? So for breads, looking for that designation again of kind of 100% whole wheat or 100% whole, whatever the grain is. Ideally selecting breads that have 2 to 3 grams of fiber per slice and 0 grams of added sugar, or picking one with less added sugar if you're choosing between 2. And then in terms of cereals, again, not all carbs are created equal. So we're looking for things that are going to have ideally greater than 4 grams of fiber, and then also less than 5 grams of sugar, or that added sugar. And I'll show in just a few slides kind of what that looks like on the label. Again, we're talking about kind of sugar where quantity and quality matter. So the AICR, again, one of their recommendations for sugar is to limit specifically consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages or fast foods and processed foods that are high in fat, sugar, or kind of those processed starches. So this is an area where if you're eating a lot of high sugar foods throughout the day, again, that usually means some excess calorie consumption. And over time, that can make weight management more difficult. We know that gaining excess body fat over time can increase the risk for several forms of cancer, as well as increasing risk over time for diabetes, heart disease, and other health problems. So in addition to these studies, it also shows that people who are eating a lot of foods with added sugar tend to have less consumption of those low in health promoting foods. So the things that are rich in fiber and those other protective nutrients. So oftentimes we want to look for ways to add those more naturally occurring sugars, things like fruit, unsweetened milk, and yogurt. These don't seem to have the same health risk associated with them. And likely that's because of the other nutrients they provide. They're going to feel more filling. They have protein. They're rich in other nutrients. So they're less likely to be eaten in excess. How much sugar you eat at one time is also important, especially if you have a history of type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, or other stages of insulin resistance. This is because how much sugar we eat at one time influences how much our blood sugar is going to surge or increase after we eat. Increases in blood sugar are also are not from sugar consumption alone. There are other factors that can cause a rise in blood sugar, but a lot of times what we see is that carbohydrate is going to lead to this temporary rise in blood sugar. And the more carbohydrate, especially the more processed carbohydrate we eat at one time, the higher that spike in blood sugar will be. Part of the things we want to think about if there are conditions of kind of insulin resistance or a tendency towards higher blood sugars, that is where we want to think about perhaps working with a registered dietitian to find the best foods to pair, for example, the protein or the healthy fats or those fiber-rich foods so that we can find ways to help keep blood sugars in a safer range. So then again, what are we looking for on the label? So there have been some updates to the nutrition facts panel, actually just in the last couple of years, where what you'll notice is, for both of these foods, they both have 37 grams of total carbohydrate, but the distinction is that one of those has 4 grams of fiber, and the rest is all from naturally occurring forms of sugar, versus the other example on the right, you'll see that highlight for the 10 grams of added sugar. So under that kind of not all carbs are created equal, from a health perspective, the one that has more equal fiber but less added sugar is going to be better for your blood sugar trends over time. The recommendation from the American Heart Association for added sugar is for men to limit to 36 grams per day or 9 teaspoons of added sugar, no more than. And for women to limit to 6 teaspoons or no more than 25 grams per day of added sugar. So then again, tips for reducing added sugar. This can be thinking about saving sugar-sweetened beverages for occasional use. For example, making water your default beverage, keeping unsweetened sparkling water or infused waters on hand, being aware of concentrated sources or of added sugar in sweet treats, kind of be selective about your favorites, keep an eye on your portion, choose smaller amounts, and savor. And also that it's not all or nothing. The correlation with excess weight gain and negative health outcomes is strongly associated with regular consumption, kind of daily, multiple times a day, several times a week. So rather thinking about kind of how much and how often, also trying not to give kind of the labels of bad or comfort food, but simply considering the foods you enjoy and maybe which should be included more often versus less often and maybe in limited quantities. So kind of the bottom line when it comes to carbohydrates, if there is consumption of things like sugar-sweetened beverages, perhaps consider scaling back on these. Notice where added sugars are present in one's diet, aiming to reduce total added sugar to ideally less than 24 grams per day. Not counting things like fruit and starchy vegetables towards those added sugars. And then when enjoying foods with added sugar, you may think about ways to adjust the recipe if possible, without sacrificing flavor or pleasure. As well as eating these foods alongside with foods that are rich in fiber, protein, and or healthy fats, which is going to help curb the blood sugar rise and the insulin response to these foods. So hopefully that gives a little bit of insight around carbohydrates kind of as a category, so that we can hopefully find ways to include those in a balanced and thoughtful way.
Thank you so much, Hannah. We did get a question in the chat. Somebody asked about what about pasta? I don't know if you have anything that you want to say.
Yeah. So, when we think about pasta, the two categories, kind of the large categories are going to be like your whole wheat pasta and then your like traditional pastas. These are all going to be coming from naturally occurring forms of carbohydrate. It's not something where sugar is added to them. But the difference about kind of pasta types out there is going to be the whole grain is higher in fiber. But naturally, the texture is going to be a little different too. So I think when we think about those foods, if you like whole grain pasta, that's great. But on some level, the amount of carbohydrate is the same, whether it's a white pasta, which has some of those fiber elements removed, or it is a whole grain pasta. So the biggest thing is kind of thinking about just quantity and what are we eating it alongside? Are we adding protein? Are we adding colorful vegetables, things that are going to help curb the response to those foods? Part of what also happens with pasta, we don't feel as full from carbohydrates on their own. So when we eat them on their own, it's easier to eat them in larger quantities because our brain doesn't always get that feedback mechanism of fullness. So it's thinking about what are we eating it with? There certainly are also some really nice pastas that have some protein added to them, whether that's a chickpea base, a lentil base. Barilla makes one that's pea protein enhanced. So that can also be a nice way to kind of have an alternative to the whole grain pasta that is also going to help balance blood sugars a little better.
Great, thank you. And we had another question. Do you recommend a particular brand of bread?
I would say not necessarily a typical brand, but just using kind of that framework around, let me see if I can find, easily slip back to the slide. Just thinking about, oh, there it was, looking at the label for ideally some percentage of the grain coming from a whole grain and then aiming for that at least 2 to 3 grams of fiber and less added sugar. There's a lot of brands out there that do kind of match those characteristics. So I think some of it also just comes down to kind of personal preference as you're navigating those characteristics.
Fabulous, thank you.
Of course.
I think that's all the questions for now. So thank you so much, Hannah, for that important comprehensive program on carbohydrates. As I mentioned earlier, the session was recorded and it will be posted on our Blum YouTube playlist. So please keep an eye out for that. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Hannah, for presenting.
Great. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Take care.